Welcome to the Antigen Cyber Podcast. I'm Timothy D. Block, Director of Advisor Services at Antigen. With me today, as always, Stephen Legg, the CEO of Antigen Security. Stephen, how are you?
Doing well, Tim. How are you?
Good. But I think for this one, we're kind of reversing roles.
Yeah, we are. Just to talk a bit about API security. So let's go ahead and get right into it. What is API security specifically, or how would you define it?
So really APIs, it's application programming interface. So when I first, and this was a hot topic last year at the end of last year, beginning of this year, and then AI came out, generative AI came out and kind of took over the news cycle there. But APIs have been around a really long time. And I've tried to explain them in the past, like to GRC folks who are not technical, and it involved spaceships and ports and lasers, and it didn't really go well. So really you have to start at APIs, and I did find, and I just wrapped up. It was my talk for this year, so I've talked about it quite a lot. You can go to my YouTube channel. There's a few different sessions that were recorded on there. But the best description I've seen is actually a meme of like a restaurant, right? And so if you think about a restaurant, you got your back end, which is your kitchen, your cooks. That could be something like your database, your actual storefront, which is where you go to the API to actually access the APIs. And the APIs themselves are their waiter, right? And then the menu you get from the restaurant is kind of your documentation. So that would be your Swagger or Postman files, which is a term that developers should know and should be doing. It's documenting your APIs so that you know how to actually use it, and how tooling and people can come in and start actually using the API in a specific way. APIs, I think, are very much the next evolution in application development and application security. It actually improves security, helps innovation. The APIs allow you to essentially, instead of having to write custom code for a bunch of stuff, it allows you to put something out there. So for example, one of the examples I used in my talk was Google Roads. So Google has put out an API for you to use Google Roads. It's essentially a lot of the same stuff around mapping how long it takes someone to get somewhere if you use Google Maps or Waze. It's mapping and it's actually tracking people's time and how long they're taking to travel a route. That's how you know how long it takes you to get somewhere. It'll show traffic patterns, things like that. But Google has made that API available. So other services, like delivery services. So your drivers for Amazon and UPS and some of the other ones are tracked by their company so that they can, one, make the most efficient route, but then like a general time when things are going to pop up. Taking that a step further, DoorDash, Uber Eats, when you order that online, you get to see the person going to the restaurant to pick up your stuff or store, and then you can see the path they're taking and the expected time. So that's all driven by APIs. If a developer had to write custom code for that for all those different companies, it would be a nightmare. So APIs are kind of that way for people to use different services that are publicly available. You have internal stuff too. We'll kind of get into that as well. But then you also have your partner. So for defining a scope, it's kind of, what you have externally available, what you're using internally. And then partners would be something like your software application or software as a service stuff. So think CRMs, Workday, ServiceNow. All that stuff has APIs that you can tap into and leverage. And that's how like tooling starts really connecting within one another. That was kind of a long way of explaining it, but security is essentially the making sure that those APIs aren't abused. And why it's an advancement for security is that things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting aren't as much of a issue with APIs anymore. So actually, we've kind of restricted it down to a lot of it. And if you can go look at the OWASP top 10 API issues, and it's authentication authorization is just up and down the list. There's also some misuse, and then there's also inventory, which is pretty much tough for a lot of different organizations. This also aligns with I use a Postman State of the API report. Postman is a development company. they do the uh, post. Yeah, they helped with the documentation for developers, right? Um, and their issues align pretty well with security. So security for APIs, it's a lot of authentication authorization. Our world is kind of turned into there are no more perimeters. It's your identity, right? So that's the zero trust model, and really authenticating the person to say who they say they are. APIs are kind of the same way. A lot of the issues with APIs come down to did you authenticate and authorize a person to use the APIs properly. Um, and so, and a lot of, I ran a pen test team, and the pen test team a lot of times would find like tokens and sensitive information, credentials within those APIs too. So it's keeping your your sensitive credentials outside of, your APIs and even outside of your repository. So, APIs, it can be internally developed apps. It can be apps that you're used. A lot of that's why I was talking to the GRC is that they're trying to um, evaluate third-party APIs that we might call into to do stuff. And my team also had the pleasure of testing a lot of those, and again finding a lot of those same issues. It's been authentic, but that's also that really helps us limit down the security concerns around that stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Well, and you kind of answered this a few different ways, but just to and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong or if I misheard or I'm misstating, but the role that APIs play in the overall security of organizations now, and the role that they will play in the future, is largely, as you said, been escalating really for the last 15, 20 years as they rose in the advent of using APIs for interacting between systems and software. Became an emerging and voluminous trend. So for folks that are using APIs, they're trying to wrap their head around securing how they implement or access and utilize APIs. You mentioned the OWASP top 10. You've mentioned some of the guidance. What are the I guess different types of APIs or common types that are out there, and how what are some good first steps for folks that might be considering one versus another?
Yeah, so we have REST is by far the one most used. Again, that comes from the Postman State of the API report. SOAP, which was the other one, that's actually the one that security professionals probably like, but it was also more restrictive for developers. So REST is kind of, you can think about it as it's got a lot more flexibility, but that also means you have to configure the security settings on that API a lot more. Which again is why it's been adopted, is because developers, they want to get the job done and they want to have that flexibility. GraphQL is really coming up as well. That aligns with a lot of your database querying for like data analytics, things like that. So really, I mean, and I expect it's hard to answer your question of which one to use, because I feel like it's going to be a JavaScript framework type of thing, where at one point JavaScript frameworks felt like there was a new one coming out every week. So I imagine there's going to be more APIs that come out. And you get into a lot of different stuff. You get into webhooks and RPC and XML and all this. And I'm, I've seen the underlying code for some of this some of these third parties, and they've pretty much got their own like written language underneath the hood there, and their APIs are written out of that stuff. So as far as like companies choosing it, you really just need to define and really, I always am a big proponent of working with developers. Like, what do they want to use? And then we should be accommodating and trying to figure out the best way to use that. And pretty much ensuring that you're working together on it. Because if you don't show, if you're like, oh, we're going to go use SOAP, a lot of developers aren't going to like that, because clearly a lot of them prefer REST, and some of them even want to try newer stuff that's out there. And again, it's just understanding that there's a nuance to this stuff. It's really, okay, use it, but let's do the authentication authorization. So that's a big focus for APIs, is making sure that stuff's getting done, and you can put certain toolings in place to test that, but then also having someone manually go do it. Because one of the things I didn't discuss with API security, but is pretty huge, is abuse cases. So these are not necessarily security vulnerabilities, right? These are if you're a retail company, has a coupon code out there. If it doesn't get expired properly, someone can come in and start checking out, and buying stuff at a significant discount, which costs the business money, but isn't necessarily a security vulnerability. That's just an abuse case of the API. So it's for security people, we should be really focused on authentication authorization, and then helping really define those abuse cases.
Got it. So it sounds like similar to how someone would respond if you ask the question, what language should I develop my software in? Choosing the right API framework and implementing it are two entirely different conversations and are better informed by kind of both the systems, the people, and just generally what the business outcomes and priorities are of a given effort that involves APIs. More than, this is a good starting point, that's a good starting point. It's less prescriptive like that. It's more based on kind of where you are and what you're trying to accomplish.
Well, and what I always point to is the documentation is already there for all these APIs. So there's an open API specification out there. It covers security, which is primarily authentication authorization. Like really just making sure the developers are doing things the right way. You still have your application security processes, your software, your static application security testing tools, and your dynamic application security testing tools. So they still need to follow the proper SDLC, but it's really just understanding that nuance and making sure that those risks are being accounted for.
Got it. So I guess in terms of how APIs are commonly utilized, we've talked a bit about the security implications, as well as some of the operational implications or risks, like the abuse cases you kind of outlined. But when should organizations really be thinking about their API security strategy and the use of APIs in general? Is it only if they're developing software? Is it if they're utilizing APIs in the regular course of the business? Kind of where does the thought process start?
Yes, is your answer to that one. Again, the world is going APIs. It's not only half of the respondents to the Postman State of the API report were developers. A lot of them were people outside of development, and that included your C-suite, CTOs, CEOs, which is a little scary. Security was actually on there as well, but they were way down on the list. But APIs are in everything, right? And it's APIs on APIs. And I just, with ChatGPT, speaking of AI, that's going to help write more code in general. And a lot of it's going to be, you can write an API using ChatGPT in a minute and a half. I've timed it. I had the demo for it, recorded, ready to go, and it was created and done. Now you don't take that necessarily into production, but you've got them everywhere. It's for development. It's for, like I mentioned, the GRC team or your third-party risk team of identifying what are you actually plugging into, and are they secure on their end, especially if you're sending that sensitive information. So really, you've got to start with inventory and understanding also, where is all your data being used within the organization? It's the same strategy for really anything within the security ecosystem, right? It's who has access to this stuff, and why are they accessing it, and is it secure? Can someone outside of that access it? APIs are the same way. If you're sending, if you're sending health information to a third party as part of a health company from a third party service, you need to make sure that data is secured and it's properly, and that someone coming to the API is not going to be able to abuse it and get your data. So and a lot of organizations have kind of shifted to this cloud model that they don't host a lot of their applications in house, and I would continue to see that. And so you've got all those APIs to worry about as well. But really, if you're just starting, you got to start somewhere. You got to start with the inventory, understanding all this different stuff. You might break that up too. You might have your GRC team go after, or look at the partner APIs. Your application security people will want to understand the APIs that are being developed in-house and externally available.
Got it. Okay. So I guess, are there any common abuse cases that different folks should think about? You mentioned, someone potentially exploiting a process that involved a cost to the organization via API. That's a risk or abuse case. But are there any abuse cases that, or is there, like within OWASP, a set of common abuse cases that exist that it can be pointed to for developers that are wanting to start understand how to better utilize their APIs and build more structure around how they're engaging with them?
Yeah, I mean, developers in general, unit tests are going to be really important for a lot of that stuff. A lot of them don't like writing that, but I have talked to developers, and they're seeing a benefit in AI and being able to write unit tests for a lot of their stuff. So maybe we'll see some improvement there. But as far as abuse cases go, that to me is threat modeling. And that is something I feel like I've been pitching for the last several years. That might be I think I might just make that the talk for next year. Is threat modeling and how to do it, because it keeps coming up in every sort of topic I talk about. But it's so simple. It's cost effective. You really just taking a whiteboard and drawing on it, right? Like you're going back to kindergarten where you're just drawing squares and circles and arrows and all that different stuff, and then coloring it in with all the all the information. You really need that to really identify your abuse cases. Because what's applicable for retail is not necessarily applicable for a health organization. Another one at the early part of 2023 was T-Mobile had an API open that leaked 37 million customer information. That's a lot. That is a large thing, and that's all PII, right? So that's the I guess that is a bit of a authentication authorization issue, but for T-Mobile, they are. I just switched phones recently, and it's actually become a lot easier to be able to switch carriers. You're not having to go talk to someone, sit on a phone for 20 minutes. It's like you go to a website, get a pen, you go to the new place, you give them the pen, right? There were probably APIs on the back end there, and that is how we SIM swapping is a big thing in the industry. Not saying that involves more social engineering and talking to people, but if we're shifting a lot of that to the APIs, then that could be an abuse case where it's working as intended, but it's working as intending allowed someone to do abuse that API. So it just really it's hard to define, and it's really just has to be per company and really getting in there and trying to identify how is the API being used, which is also a good thing. It gets threat modeling gets people on the same page of understanding it. And I've used it not only for new APIs, but also existing APIs, because developers will come in, build something, and then they leave 2 to 3 years later, and no one remembers anything about it, right? But it is a key part of some function within the organization that needs to keep the business running. That sitting down and understanding that will allow you to better understand it, but then also better understand how you abuse that API. And I'll give you a story here. I was sitting with developers, and we were talking about some sort of application that was going to tap into Active Directory, which could be considered like an API type of connection there, right? And as we were talking through some of the attack scenarios, one of the developers went, "Oh, wait, so I could automate this to lock out your account?" And I went, "Yes, you can." Because of 3 fatal attempts, my account's locked out. Is that a vulnerability? Not necessarily, but that is an abuse case. The developers were very giddy. I was both proud, but then also now a little scared. Those are just, it kind of depends on the application and what its intent to do, and really trying to think through hey, how can we abuse this for malicious means? And then if you really want to find that out, I will say pen testers are really good at thinking that way. They're also really good at discovering the APIs, and then attacking them. So I always recommend doing some sort of manual test where they're not only testing for the usual stuff, right? Looking for those sensitive tokens, and you still want to check for SQL injection, fuzzing, resource consumption, things like that. But they can also really identify if there's any abuse cases that can, impact the organization.
Got it. That makes total sense. So I guess just to kind of bring all of that together, you've kind of covered what folks should think about if they're considering leveraging APIs further, or if they're just starting to leverage APIs. You've talked a bit about some more advanced topics and things that people using APIs to currently should be thinking about and frameworks they should be looking at. Is there anything else that you think is really critical for people to take away and know about, whether it's API security or APIs in general, folks that are considering any or all of these things?
Yeah, I think we haven't really touched on. I touch on this in my talk. Is the API security vendor landscape? It's a newer tool set. So it's a maturing space. It's really just either a WAF, you're doing web application firewall on your APIs, or you're doing some sort of testing within the pipeline. That's what I've seen out of the two vendors. So I'm curious to see how that landscape, the tooling landscape, shakes out over the coming years, because I would expect as that space matures, we're gonna see some new vendor ideas coming out. I also suspect, because API, everyone thinks application security, but it's actually a bit of both, or it's a combination of three different disciplines. It's your network engineering. So if you're looking to do a web application firewall, that involves some sort of tapping into the network equipment. But then, if there's alerts from that, are you going to have your one, network engineer or application security engineer look at it? Or are you going to send it over to your security operations center that should be investigating and seeing if something's being abused within the API? So that's, and I just suspect that API security might become its own discipline at some point, where it'll be focused. It's large enough. Again, it kind of runs the gamut of your GRC team is involved with it as far as partner APIs, and then you have internally developed ones. And then if anybody's using a publicly available one, that can get people in trouble too, because I think, it was last year, the healthcare industry got in trouble for, and this is more just putting code on the website, but it could still be applicable for APIs, is putting Google Analytics on a health portal, right? That has some serious privacy concerns, because your data is being shot off to Google somewhere, right? As far as people logging into stuff. So, there's all those considerations going on. And I just see, a lot of like cloud security is becoming its own discipline. I expect API security to become its own thing. And so team, and not saying you have to spin up an entire API security team yet, but you have to think, is this going to be something the application security person or team handles, or is this going to be something that you want to spread across teams and really build some sort of strategy around that? So.
Got it. So less, do we need to do that? More, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's what we need to think about. Not dissimilar from considering security before implementing an IT project. Like if you're working with systems that involve APIs, these are conversations you should be having. Who's owning it? How are we securing it? What are the risks? What are the abuse cases we're concerned about? All of those things are kind of the meat and potatoes of the start of that conversation. Is that
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, I didn't even mention, the IAM team. That's another team that's been spun up over the last several years, and rightly so. IAM is a big thing, and that for APIs, that's their number one concern is are you authenticating properly to that API, and do you have things like MFA and other things in place? So yeah, to your point, yeah, it's absolutely making sure you understand what's going on and how it's being used. And I'll say, people, like I said, APIs are everywhere now. So people can look at it and go, oh, this is a big problem. It's going to continue too. So, addressing it, you got to start somewhere. And it's really just, it's not unlike anything else. Identifying where's your sensitive data that's really important to you. What's going to get you in the most trouble with, whatever body, organization, or, public. Identifying where all that stuff is and starting to address those, and then kind of working your way down that priority list.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Well, and we practice the same kind of methodology from a cyber risk management assessment in general, and would recommend kind of the same things. You need to understand what the business is doing and what you're trying to accomplish and what the risks are in those specific systems or processes before you even start to consider what to implement, how to implement it, or what needs to be involved. So that all makes perfect sense to me. Well, Tim, really, really appreciate the insight and input as always. Are there any final thoughts you want to leave our guests with?
No, like I said, APIs I think are a good thing. They're an advancement, so people can, new technology can be a bit scary, but you just apply the same strategies, understand the nuances, and then do the best you can with it, and try to like you said, manage the risk there.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you, Tim, for the plethora of insight, and thanks everybody for joining us. Hope to see you next time.
All right. See you.